Do you remember the everyday challenges that made every 60s kid tougher than kids today? Growing up then meant fewer safety nets, more freedom to roam, and learning by doing without someone hovering over you. Looking back now, did we lose something when childhood got safer? Riding in cars without seatbelts was not just common, it was expected. In the 1960s, most cars did not even come with seatbelts as standard, and if they did, they were often buried between the seats, unused. Kids piled into the back seat, sometimes lying down to nap on long drives, other times kneeling to wave at the car behind them. Parents smoked, the radio played, and nobody thought twice about safety harnesses. The back window ledge was prime real estate for a quick nap in the sun. Road trips were noisy, full of shifting bodies and the occasional sibling argument. Accidents happened, but the mindset was that life had risks and you just lived with them. A sudden stop might send you tumbling forward, but that was just part of the ride. Today, the thought of driving without buckling up is unthinkable, but in the 1960s it was just another sign that kids were tougher because they were expected to roll with whatever happened. Riding bikes without helmets or pads was how freedom felt in the 1960s. You hopped on your bike, often with a banana seat and tall handlebars, and took off down the block without a single piece of protective gear. Falls were inevitable. Knees were scraped, elbows bloodied, and sometimes even a tooth got chipped, but you got back on. There was no talk about concussions or wrist guards. Your parents' advice was simply, "Be careful," and then they turned back to whatever they were doing. You learned how to steer better, how to brake just right, and how to avoid gravel patches that could send you flying. By the end of summer, your legs were a map of healed scabs, each one a badge of adventure. Helmets would have seemed like overkill back then, and the idea was that taking a spill was just part of becoming a capable rider. Playing outside. Until the streetlights came on was the unspoken rule in nearly every neighborhood. Parents sent you out after breakfast, and aside from a quick run home for lunch, you were gone until dusk. There were no cell phones, no GPS trackers. Your parents had no clue where you were exactly, only that you would be back when the lights flickered on. The streets were your playground, with kickball games, hide and seek, and endless bike rides filling the hours. You learned to judge time by the position of the sun. If you pushed your luck and came home late, you heard about it, but you were rarely kept inside the next day. Freedom came with responsibility, and every kid knew that being allowed to roam meant you had to keep yourself out of real trouble. That independence made you tougher. Nobody was looking over your shoulder every second. Walking to school alone. Even in bad weather was just part of life. If you lived close enough, there was no bus, just your own 2 feet and whatever the sky threw at you. Rain, snow, biting wind, it did not matter. You bundled up if you had the gear, and if not, you toughed it out. Friends met up along the route, forming small groups that trudged through the slush or crunched over icy sidewalks. There was no such thing as a snow day, unless the storm was so bad the whole town shut down. You arrived with cold fingers and red cheeks, shaking off the chill before the bell rang. The walk itself taught you endurance and a certain pride, getting there on your own power, no matter the conditions. Playing contact sports without protective gear meant exactly what it sounds like. You played hard and you took your lumps. Backyard football was tackle, not touch. Baseball was played with a real hard ball, and if it hit you, you felt it for days. Soccer meant shin-to-shin collisions, and hockey on frozen ponds came with plenty of bruises. Every fall, scrape and bruise became a story you wore proudly. Proof that you had been in the game and taken the hits. You measured toughness not by avoiding pain, but by getting back up after it. There were no mouth guards for Little League, no face cages for hockey helmets, if you even had a helmet at all. You learned quickly to keep your head up, protect yourself, and play smart. Injuries were handled with ice packs and rest, and the only time you sat out was if you truly could not move. It made you aware of your limits and how to push through discomfort without giving up. Climbing trees and building makeshift forts was part survival training, part pure fun. You tested branches before putting your weight on them, learning balance and caution the hard way. Scratches from bark and the occasional splinter were just part of the deal. Your forts were built from whatever you could find: old boards, cardboard, rope, and they rarely met any kind of safety standard. Every wobbly nail and crooked wall was the result of your own effort, and that made it special. Even if it fell apart, you were already planning how to rebuild it stronger. Still, you spent hours up there, looking down at the world from your self-made hideout. Rain might force you down, but more often than not, you stayed until someone called you home. Working with what you had, making it stand, and climbing higher each time built a mix of confidence and grit that no prepackaged playset could match. Using a pocket knife for everyday tasks was a rite of passage for many kids. You might have gotten your first one from your dad, an uncle, or even a grandparent, along with a quick rundown on how not to cut yourself. It was used for everything: sharpening sticks, cutting rope, whittling small toys, or peeling an apple. Carrying it in your pocket made you feel prepared for anything, even if anything usually meant cutting string or opening a stubborn package. That small piece of metal represented a kind of freedom you could feel every time you heard the blade click open. The responsibility was real. Misuse it, and you lost the privilege. Accidents happened. A small nick on your finger was treated with a rinse and a bandage, not panic. You learned careful handling, blade safety, and the satisfaction of being trusted with a tool that could actually hurt you if you were careless. That sense of trust was part of what made you feel grown up, and it taught you to respect the tools in your hands. Playing in vacant lots or construction sites was a normal extension of your territory. These places were full of hazards: rusty nails, broken glass, unstable structures, but they were also full of possibilities. You turned piles of dirt into forts, climbed half-built walls, and imagined grand battles in empty foundations. Parents knew where you were, more or less, and just told you to watch yourself. You knew that every step could be risky, but that was part of the excitement that kept you coming back. The danger sharpened your instincts in ways a fenced-in playground never could. The dangers were obvious, and it was up to you to avoid them. You learned to spot weak boards, listen for creaks, and help friends out of tricky spots. The thrill of exploring places you technically were not supposed to be made you braver, sharper, and a little more self-reliant. Helping with heavy chores around the house was not optional. It was expected. Kids hauled firewood, shoveled snow, carried laundry baskets, and helped move furniture when needed. You did not get paid for it. It was simply part of being in the family. Some chores were tiring, others were unpleasant, but they taught you the value of pitching in without complaint. Your hands might blister, your back might ache, but quitting halfway was never on the table. You learned early that the satisfaction of finishing a hard job was worth more than any allowance. Working alongside adults gave you a sense of capability, and you learned skills you would use later in life. Nobody worried about whether the work was too hard for you. If you could manage it, you did it. That built both muscle and mental toughness, the kind that stuck with you well into adulthood. Handling real tools in shop class was a regular part of school for many kids. Saws, hammers, drills, you were trusted to use them correctly, and the teacher did not hover unless you proved you could not. The projects were real: birdhouses, shelves, even small furniture. You learned to measure twice, cut once, and fix your mistakes without tossing the whole thing out. Cuts and splinters were common, but they were treated as part of the process, not reasons to stop. The pride of taking something home that you had built with your own two hands outweighed any minor injuries along the way. Shop class taught responsibility, precision, and respect for tools, things that carried over into every other part of life. Fixing your own flat bike tire was not just some rite of passage, it was practically a survival skill if you were a kid in the 1960s. If you wanted to ride with your friends, go to the park, or just take a cruise around the block, you could not afford to wait for your dad to get home or for a bike shop to take pity on you. The idea of parents dropping everything to fix it for you? Forget it. You were expected to know how to flip the bike over, get the wheel off, and start the dirty, finger-numbing process of pulling the tire away from the rim. No YouTube tutorials, no step-by-step booklet, just the advice your older cousin gave you once 2 summers ago. You learned how to find the hole by dunking the tube in a bucket of water and watching for bubbles. Then you'd scrounge up an old patch kit that smelled faintly of rubber cement. If you were lucky, you had the right size wrench. If not, you improvised with whatever tool you could get your hands on. The hands got filthy, the knees got scraped, and somehow, by the end of it, the bike was ready to ride again. There was pride in pedaling away on something you brought back from the dead with your own hands, and if you did not patch it right, well, you would be doing it all over again the next day, which meant you got better at it fast. No one called it resilience back then, but that is exactly what it was. You either learned or you walked. Playing baseball in the street was not just a pastime, it was the default setting for every summer afternoon in the 1960s. Nobody had perfectly maintained sports fields or organized leagues with matching uniforms unless you were really lucky. You grabbed whatever bat was lying around, wooden, metal, cracked, or taped together, and someone would produce a scuffed ball that had seen better days. The outfield was somebody's yard, the infield was the asphalt, and home plate was an old sweatshirt tossed on the ground. You had to be quick on your feet, not just to hit or catch the ball, but to dodge traffic every few minutes. The shouts of "car" were as much a part of the game as the crack of the bat. Everyone knew the rules were fluid. Sometimes a foul ball was just play on, and sometimes it meant chasing it 3 houses down. You learned to hit around parked cars, run bases with potholes in them, and slide without worrying about ripping your pants or your knees. Nobody thought about shin guards or helmets. You just played, bruises and all. It was about the game, about proving you could hang with the bigger kids, and about squeezing every last minute of daylight before your mom called you in for dinner. That combination of improvisation, adaptability, and just plain toughness was baked into every game you played in the street. Drinking water straight from the garden hose was as natural to a 1960s kid as breathing. Nobody was talking about filtered water or BPA-free anything. If you were playing outside and got thirsty, you just turned on the spigot, let it run for a second so it was not scalding hot, and drank your fill right there. Sometimes the water had a faint taste of rubber from the hose, sometimes it was a little warm, and sometimes there was a tiny bug floating in it, but you drank it anyway. It was cold, it was free, and it saved you from having to go inside where an adult might suddenly remember chores they wanted you to do. You would pass the hose to the next kid like it was the most natural thing in the world. No wipes, no hand sanitizer, no thought about germs. And if the hose kinked, you just walked your hand down it until the water burst out again, spraying everybody in the process. It was refreshing, it was practical, and it taught you not to be picky about where your hydration came from. You built an immunity to half the world's bacteria before you even hit middle school. And no one thought twice about it. You were thirsty, you drank, and you went right back to playing until the streetlights came on. Making your own toys from spare parts was not just a rainy day project. It was often the only way you got something new to play with. You raided the garage, the basement, and sometimes the neighbor's trash to find bits and pieces of anything that could be turned into something else. Old roller skate wheels could be screwed onto a plank to make a crude skateboard. Wooden crates became go-karts if you had the patience and enough nails. Even a busted broom handle could be transformed into the frame for a homemade kite. Kids in the 1960s had to see possibility in junk. There were no pre-made kits with instructions, you just figured it out. Half the time, the toy you built fell apart within an hour, but that just meant you got to rebuild it, stronger and better than before. There was no such thing as waste, not when you could make a slingshot from an old inner tube or build a fort out of scrap plywood. Your toys came from your imagination, your resourcefulness, and your ability to convince your friends that this lopsided contraption was the best thing ever. And you know what? It usually was, because it was yours. Shoveling neighbors' driveways for a few bucks was one of the first real hustles a kid could have in the 1960s. There was no calling a snow removal service or relying on a machine. Kids were the snow removal service. When the first flakes started falling, you would already be plotting which houses you could hit before someone else got there. Armed with a shovel that was probably too big for you, you trudged through snowdrifts and icy sidewalks before the sun was even up. You learned quickly how to pace yourself so you did not burn out before lunch, and how to deal with the occasional cranky neighbor who swore they did not need help, but still gave you a quarter for trying. Your gloves got wet, your boots filled with snow, and your back ached by the end of the day. But you also walked home with pockets jangling with change. That money was pure independence. You could spend it on baseball cards, a soda, or save up for something bigger, and every time you looked at your frostbitten hands, you knew you had earned it. Skating on rough pavement with metal wheel skates was practically a contact sport in itself. The kind of smooth, polished skate parks we have today did not exist for neighborhood kids in the 1960s. You had clunky skates that strapped over your shoes and rattled with every bump in the road. The noise they made on cracked sidewalks was loud enough to alert the entire block you were coming. Every pebble felt like a mountain, and if you hit it wrong, you were going down hard. Sometimes you would take off on a downhill stretch, picking up so much speed that the wind roared in your ears and your teeth rattled. You could not stop gracefully, so you learned how to grab onto a fence, a lamppost, or even a friend to slow yourself down. Kids compared scars from their falls like badges of honor, each one telling a story of a turn taken too sharp or a rock that came out of nowhere. The sound of those wheels grinding against the sidewalk is burned into the memory of anyone who lived it. Even when your ankles screamed from the strain, you kept going, because giving up just was not an option. Knees and elbows were constantly scraped, and the metal wheels left your feet tingling after just a few blocks. But you kept going because that was what you had. You learned how to steer around potholes, how to lean just right to keep your balance, and how to laugh it off when you inevitably took a spill in front of your friends. There was no helmet, no knee pads, and no such thing as a safe landing. But you got up, tightened the straps, and pushed on. Walking to the store to buy cigarettes for your parents was just another chore in the 1960s, and nobody blinked an eye at it. Your mom or dad would hand you some coins and a note for the clerk, and off you went, sometimes with your younger sibling in tow. You would walk several blocks, pass all your friends playing outside, and head straight into the store where the smell of tobacco and candy mixed into something oddly comforting. The cashier knew you, knew your parents, and did not hesitate to hand over the pack. Sometimes you would get sidetracked, pressing your face to the toy shop window or watching older kids play pinball in the diner. The walk there and back was a small slice of independence, a time when you could feel like you had a real job. Even the weight of the paper bag in your hand felt important, like you were trusted with something grown up. You learned to dodge traffic, cut across empty lots, and take the fastest shortcut home when rain clouds rolled in. That little errand carried more lessons in responsibility than most people realize today. Sometimes you got to keep the change for a piece of gum or a soda on the way home. You carried the cigarettes back in a paper bag like it was no big deal. No one lectured about age restrictions or secondhand smoke. It was just part of life, part of being trusted to run errands like an adult, and part of why kids grew up fast in those days. Eating whatever was on the table was non-negotiable. A 1960s dinner table was not a restaurant with a menu, it was whatever your parents made, and you ate it or you went hungry. Nobody was catering to picky eaters or making a separate plate for the kid who did not like peas. You learned to swallow things you did not like and keep going. Liver, Brussels sprouts, mystery casseroles, it was all fair game. The smell of dinner cooking would fill the whole house long before it was ready, and you could usually tell if you were in for a good night or a rough one. Plates were portioned out without asking, and you took what you got. Complaining was pointless. At best, you would be ignored. At worst, you would be reminded that kids are starving in other countries. The clink of silverware and the sound of your parents talking about their day set the pace for eating. Dessert, if there was any, was only for those who cleaned their plates. Sometimes the food was amazing, sometimes it was barely edible. But either way, you ate it because wasting food was unthinkable. Meals were about being together as a family, not about tailoring the menu to personal tastes. And if you were smart, you learned little tricks. How to mix the worst vegetable with mashed potatoes so it went down easier. Or how to drink water after every bite to wash it away faster. It was not about loving every bite. It was about finishing your plate and being grateful there was food on it. Carrying heavy glass soda bottles home from the store was a workout you did not even know you were signing up for. Back then, soda came in sturdy glass bottles packed into wooden or cardboard crates. If your parents sent you to pick some up, that meant lugging a load that felt like it doubled in weight every block you walked. The bottles clinked together with every step, threatening to break if you stumbled, and you had to shift the crate from one hip to the other to keep going. Sometimes you would pause halfway home to rest, setting the crate down on the curb while shaking out your arms. In summer, the sun would heat the glass so it was almost hot to the touch, adding to the struggle. In winter, your fingers would go numb against the cold glass, making you grip even harder. Passing neighbors would give you a nod, knowing exactly what kind of task you were hauling. Every step made you more determined to get home without dropping a single bottle. Sometimes you brought them back empty to collect the deposit, which meant walking there and back with something heavy either way. Your hands would ache, your arms would burn, and by the time you made it home, you felt like you had just finished a workout because you had. And nobody called it exercise. It was just part of running errands for the family. Sitting in a hot car while parents ran errands was a summertime endurance test every 1960s kid knew by heart. The car would be parked outside a store, the windows cracked just enough to let in a whisper of air, and you were told to stay put. The vinyl seats burned the backs of your legs, the metal seatbelt buckles were searing to the touch, and the air felt like it was being slowly baked in an oven. You would fidget, fan yourself with whatever scrap of paper you found, and count the minutes until your parents came back. Sometimes, you would make a game of tracing shapes in the fog your breath made on the glass, even if it disappeared in seconds. You learned how to sit still to conserve energy, moving as little as possible so you did not get hotter. The sound of footsteps outside would make your heart leap, only to be crushed when they passed the car. You could hear muffled music or chatter from the street, reminding you that life was happening outside while you sat and sweated. When your parents finally returned, you acted like it was no big deal, even though it felt like you had survived a desert trek. There were no screens to distract you, no air conditioning unless you rolled down the windows yourself, and no bottled water to sip on. It was uncomfortable, sometimes downright miserable, but you endured it. You stared out the window, daydreamed, and learned patience the hard way. By the time the car finally started and the hot air blasted through the vents, you felt like you had passed some kind of test you did not sign up for. But that was just life back then. Going to the doctor only when you were really sick was a way of life in the 1960s, and it shaped how tough kids became. You did not run to the clinic for every sniffle or scratch. Your parents were the first line of defense, and most treatments involved a damp washcloth, a spoonful of some bitter syrup, or being told to walk it off. You could be running a mild fever, have a skinned knee, or even a decent-sized bruise from falling off your bike, and it still was not enough to get a ride to the doctor's office. That kind of trip was reserved for something truly serious, a broken bone, an ear infection that would not go away, or a case of strep throat so bad you could barely swallow. Waiting rooms were not friendly places full of toys and TV screens either. They smelled faintly of antiseptic, and the magazines were mostly for adults. But the truth was, the less you went, the more you learned to manage the little pains and illnesses yourself. You learned to keep playing with a sore ankle, to wrap your own scraped elbows with tape, to tough out headaches and stomach aches until they passed. It was not about ignoring real problems. It was about understanding the difference between discomfort and genuine danger. Kids grew up knowing that the human body could take more than they thought, that not every ache needed fixing by a professional, and that resilience was built in the space between getting hurt and getting better. You learned that your body healed on its own most of the time, and that knowledge stayed with you for life. Sleeping on the floor at a friend's house was not something you complained about. It was practically part of the fun. Back in the 1960s, sleepovers did not come with air mattresses or perfectly arranged guest rooms. You brought a sleeping bag, maybe a pillow, and you claimed a spot on the living room carpet, the basement floor, or even the hard wood if that was all there was. Sometimes you were lucky enough to get a couch cushion or a folded-up blanket underneath you, but most of the time, you just dealt with it. The floor was lumpy, you could feel every seam of the carpet, and someone's cat might decide to walk over you in the middle of the night. The air was filled with the smell of popcorn, the sound of whispered conversations, and the occasional flashlight beam cutting through the dark. You stayed up as long as possible, knowing you would pay for it the next day. But that was part of the deal. There was no whining to go home, no insisting on special accommodations. You were there for the company, for the laughter, and for the shared experience of waking up with a sore back and messy hair. And somehow, the lack of comfort made it better. It felt adventurous, like camping without the bugs. You learned to sleep anywhere, in any position, surrounded by noise, light, or total chaos. And when you woke up and rubbed the stiffness out of your neck, you felt like you had earned another badge in the unspoken contest of toughness that all kids were in back then. Metal lunchboxes and glass thermos bottles were standard issue for 1960s kids, and they were as much a part of your daily routine as brushing your teeth. These lunchboxes were not flimsy plastic. They were solid, often decorated with your favorite TV shows or comic book heroes, and heavy enough to double as a blunt instrument if you needed it. They could take a beating in your school bag, be tossed onto the playground, and still close with that satisfying metal latch. Inside, you had the glass thermos that kept your drink cold, or at least cooler than the outside air. But those thermoses were fragile. Drop one once, and you would hear the unmistakable sound of the glass liner shattering inside, leaving your milk tasting faintly of mystery dust. Kids learned to be careful with them, cradling them like they were carrying treasure. The lunch itself was simple. A sandwich wrapped in wax paper, maybe an apple, and a cookie if you were lucky. No one cared about insulated compartments or ice packs. You just ate what was there. Sometimes the sandwich got a little squished, sometimes the apple bruised, but you did not throw it away. You ate it. Those lunchboxes were your personal badge of identity, the thing you opened every day in the cafeteria while trading cookies for chips with your friends. They were dented, scratched, and worn by the end of the year, but that was proof you had used them well. And you learned the kind of care and responsibility that came from carrying something breakable every single day. Sharing one phone for the whole family was the reality in the 1960s, and it taught kids a whole set of skills that just do not exist today. The phone was usually mounted on the kitchen wall or sitting on a small table in the living room, with a cord that stretched just far enough for you to duck into the hallway if you wanted a little privacy. But privacy was relative. Anyone could pick up another extension in the house and listen in. And sometimes they did. You had to wait your turn to use the phone, which meant learning patience, especially if your sister was talking to her friend for what felt like hours. You memorized the times when the line might be free, and you planned your calls carefully. Long-distance calls were a big deal, sometimes costing extra, so you kept them short and to the point. If a friend called for you, your parents might answer first, and you had to be polite even if you were itching to grab the receiver. There was no voicemail. If you missed a call, you just missed it. Sharing the phone meant you were aware of other people's needs, that you learned to speak clearly, and that you developed a knack for quick, efficient conversations. It also meant you understood that your social life had to fit into the rhythm of family life, not the other way around. Using payphones and memorizing numbers was a necessity, not a novelty, for 1960s kids. If you were out somewhere and needed to call home, you did not have a cell phone in your pocket. You had to find a payphone. They were on street corners, in gas stations, and outside certain stores, often smelling faintly of cigarette smoke and rain. You needed coins to make the call, so you kept a few in your pocket just in case. That meant you learned the value of carrying change and not spending it all on candy. But the real skill came from memorizing numbers. You knew your home number, your best friend's number, maybe your grandparents' number, all by heart. You could rattle them off without thinking, dialing each one by spinning the rotary dial and listening to the satisfying clicks as it returned. There were no contact lists, no saved favorites. You either remembered the number or you did not make the call. And you got good at leaving short, clear messages if someone else answered, because you never knew when you might get another chance to call back. Using a payphone taught you to plan ahead, to be resourceful, and to make every word count. It was independence in its purest form. You were out in the world, making connections on your own, one coin and one memorized number at a time. Playgrounds used to be a little more dangerous, and the metal slide on asphalt was the crown jewel of poor design. In the 1970s, nearly every school or park had one. It stood tall, often 2 stories high, baking in the sun until it could sear the back of your legs. No shade, no padding, just you, gravity, and a prayer. The steps up were made of thin metal bars. The top had no real guardrails, and when you slid down, you hit that blacktop like a dropped steak. But we lined up for it anyway, over and over. There was something thrilling about the danger. It was a rite of passage, a fast, hot, jolting ride that ended in a dusty scrape or bruised elbow. Teachers watched from afar. Parents shrugged. Kids were expected to bounce back. If you made it to the bottom without a scream, you earned bragging rights. If you got burned, you wore it like a badge. Safety standards have come a long way since then, but so much of that fearless, feral childhood play was tied to moments like these. Today, it is hard to believe we once thought that was normal, but deep down, part of us misses it. Etch-a-Sketch was a toy box essential for many kids growing up in the 1960s, a red-framed tablet that made art out of turning 2 little white knobs. Created in France and introduced to the American market in 1960, it was as magical as it was mechanical. There were no batteries, no screens, no noise, just pure possibility inside that gray, powder-filled screen. The left knob controlled horizontal lines. The right knob handled vertical ones. And with patience and lots of do-overs, you could draw a house, a name, even a passable Mickey Mouse. But here's the kicker. If you messed up, you just shook the thing. That satisfying rattle erased the entire image in an instant, giving you a clean slate. It was frustrating. It was addictive. It was mesmerizing. You might remember twisting the knob so hard your fingers hurt, trying to make curves when all it wanted to give you was straight lines. Yet when you finally got something to look just right, the pride was real. Etch-a-Sketch was art, logic, and trial and error rolled into one simple frame. In a world of ever-evolving toys, this one stayed still, and that was its power. If you grew up in the 1970s, the Atari 2600 was more than just a machine. It was a revolution. Released in 1977, it looked like something from a spaceship with its wood grain panel and chunky switches. But once you plugged it in and inserted a cartridge, everything changed. Pong, Missile Command, Space Invaders, these games turned your television into a battlefield, a racetrack, or a galaxy far, far away. It was not just about playing. It was about being inside the game. You became the paddle, the ship, the pixelated hero. The joystick was awkward and stiff, but it gave you power, real power. Before Atari, play was physical, outside with balls, bikes, or board games. After Atari, play became immersive. You could lose hours in those blinking, buzzing worlds. You could lose yourself. Parents worried, teachers warned, but kids knew better. They felt something shifting, a new kind of play, a new kind of escape. Video games were not just mindless distractions. They were portals, and Atari was the key. It changed what it meant to be a kid. It made your house feel infinite, and whether you were dodging aliens or chasing high scores, you were part of the first generation to hold a digital future in your hands. You could spot them from across the school hallway, the shine, the cut, the labels stitched loud and proud across the back pocket. Jordache and Sasson were not just jeans, they were declarations. They told you who had money, who had fashion, and who had parents that shopped at the kind of department stores that did not take coupons. These jeans were tight, flashy, and often came with matching jackets. They fit like they were made just for you, if you had a trust fund. Everyone else wore generic denim that sagged or bunched or looked like it had been handed down for 3 siblings. But the rich kids? They walked through the halls like they were on a runway. They had the attitude to match. If you had these jeans, people noticed, and if you did not, well, you noticed more. Because nothing makes you feel more like an outsider than standing next to someone who is wearing your parents' entire grocery budget just on their legs. The Easy Bake Oven brought the thrill of baking into the tiny hands of children everywhere. Released by Kenner in 1963, it looked like a pastel-colored toy, but worked like real kitchen equipment, albeit powered by a common light bulb. Slide the cake tray in, wait just long enough for anticipation to bubble, and out came a warm, soft treat you made yourself. The cakes were tiny, the brownies a bit dense, but the pride was enormous. For many young kids, especially girls at the time, the Easy Bake Oven was a first taste of independence. No parental supervision needed, no open flames, just you and a cake mix in a miniature pan. It sparked creativity, confidence, and plenty of sibling rivalries over who got the bigger slice. The toy's appeal lasted for decades, but those original models with their sleek retro look and that gentle hum from the light bulb warming up have a special place in memory. Long before kids had screens and apps, this was hands-on, slightly messy, and totally satisfying play. The smell of a baking chocolate chip cake from a 40-watt bulb is not something you easily forget. No child in the 1970s felt cooler than when riding a big wheel. With its huge front wheel, low-riding plastic seat, and bright colors, it looked like a race car designed by a kid, because it basically was. Once you hopped on and pushed those plastic pedals, you were not just moving, you were flying. Sidewalks became speedways, driveways became danger zones, and every slope was a dare. The sound of the wheels grinding on concrete was a soundtrack of summer. Every kid knew how to drift, how to slam the brake and spin out in a glorious slide that made you feel like a stuntman. Scraped knees were badges of honor. Big wheels were not built to last, but that only made you ride harder. They cracked, they faded. But while they worked, they were unstoppable. Parents loved them because they were safe. Kids loved them because they felt anything but. Riding a big wheel gave you that first taste of rebellion. You could go fast, steer wild, and race your friends with nothing between you and the road but a thin piece of plastic. It was freedom on three wheels, and for many 1970s kids, it was their first vehicle and their first addiction to speed. Tang was not just a drink, it was a symbol of the future. Pitched as the beverage astronauts drank in space, this orange powdered miracle made you feel like you were participating in the space race from your own kitchen. Every kid wanted Tang. Every mom kept a jar in the cupboard. All you needed was water and a spoon, and suddenly you were sipping the same stuff that orbited the Earth. It was sweet, artificial, and packed with flavor. And it made you feel cool. The powder never fully dissolved, which meant gritty sips near the end were just part of the experience. If you got the scoop size right, you earned that perfect bright orange glow. Too much, and it was syrupy sludge. Too little, and it was just sad orange water. Tang was more than a drink, it was a cultural event. The jar was wide and squat with a screw-on lid, and every household seemed to have one. Kids felt proud making it on their own. No adult needed. It became the go-to for lunch, after school, and Saturday cartoons. You never questioned the science behind it. You just knew that if it was good enough for NASA, it was good enough for you. That dusty scoop brought the cosmos into your kitchen. Leet Breed turned a dark room into a glowing gallery. Introduced by Hasbro in 1967, this toy was unlike anything else at the time. It featured a black screen lit from behind and a box of tiny colored pegs, red, green, blue, orange, that you pushed through holes to create luminous designs. You could trace pre-printed templates or freestyle your own masterpiece. A clown's grin, a sailboat at sunset, your own name glowing like a neon sign. The warmth from the light bulb behind the screen gave it a cozy feeling, and the soft glow made your room feel like magic. It was quiet play, patient play, the kind where your tongue stuck out in concentration and the world around you disappeared. Parents loved that it was mess-free. Kids loved that they were in control. Once finished, you sat back in the dark and admired your work, a tiny artist with your own spotlight. Over time, more templates arrived. Cartoon characters, animals, seasonal themes. But even with no pattern at all, the effect was the same. A toy that made you feel like a creator. In a world before screens lit up everything, Lite-Brite let you light up something of your own, one peg at a time. The Nerf ball was not just a toy, it was permission. Permission to throw, jump, chase, and tackle indoors without worrying about broken windows or bruised siblings. When it launched in 1969, it quietly revolutionized playtime in the 1970s. This soft, squishy ball, usually bright orange or yellow, was more than foam. It was freedom. For kids stuck indoors during rainy days or cold winters, the Nerf ball turned living rooms into stadiums. It was tossed down hallways, bounced off walls, smacked off ceilings, and it never hurt anyone. That was its genius. It let kids be rowdy without consequences. No one had to yell, "Not in the house," anymore. Suddenly, tag became dodgeball. A lazy Sunday became a full-blown game of catch, and for many kids, it was the first time a ball felt safe. It was something even little siblings could join in on. Parents accepted it, teachers tolerated it, kids lived for it. The Nerf ball was not flashy. It did not talk or light up. But it had this perfect bounce, this perfect softness, and it never failed to make playtime better. In a world full of "do not touch," Nerf was the one thing kids were always allowed to grab and throw as hard as they could. You could hear it before you saw it. That low rattle of gears and rubber on pavement, when a Raleigh chopper rolled by, every other bike might as well have disappeared. It had high-rise handlebars, a banana seat, and a frame that looked like it belonged in a motorcycle gang, not the school bike rack. And the kid riding it? Always a rich kid. Always. They would glide past you like they were in a magazine ad, not even pedaling half the time. That gear shifter in the middle of the frame looked like it was built for a race car. You had never even seen a gear shifter on a bike before. Yours probably came from the back of a hardware store. This thing looked imported from the future. And let us be honest, those bikes were not cheap. Parents who bought them were not just giving their kid a ride. They were buying attention, pride, and a neon-colored way to stand out. You tried not to care? You told yourself your bike got the job done. But deep down, watching them speed off with one hand on the bars and the other holding a can of soda, it burned. That chopper was not just a bicycle. It was a moving billboard that said, "My parents can afford it, yours cannot." Long before music was digital, it spun on plastic. Record players with built-in speakers were the backbone of every teenager's room and every family living room. They were bulky, boxy, and usually brown or beige. But when you placed that needle on the groove, the room changed. You might remember hearing the Jackson 5, the Carpenters, or Fleetwood Mac for the very first time through one of these machines. The sound was warm, slightly fuzzy, and crackled at the edges, but it was alive. Kids would stack their 45s, adjust the tone arm, and lower the needle with care. These were not sleek devices. They were furniture. Some had lids that closed like a suitcase. Others had knobs you had to gently coax into the right spot. Volume? Not much. But intimacy? All the way. You sat close to it. You knew every skip and scratch on your favorite record. You could play the same song 10 times in a row and it felt new every time. It was not about convenience, it was about connection. The record player was not background noise, it was the centerpiece of your downtime. Hearing one today might just make you stop, listen, and remember who you were when that song first played. Barrel of Monkeys was proof that the simplest ideas can last the longest. Released in 1965, the game came in a bright plastic barrel filled with plastic monkeys that linked together by their arms. That was it. No batteries, no board, no setup time. Just spill the monkeys and try to link as many as you could without dropping the chain. It was harder than it looked. The curved arms never seemed to hook just right, and one wrong move could send your whole line tumbling. But when you did it, when you made it past 10 or 15 monkeys, it felt like a small miracle. Kids would challenge each other to beat their records, dump and restart over and over, totally absorbed. The monkeys themselves were colorful, cheerful, and perfectly palm-sized. the game traveled well. It lived in car glove boxes, grandma's house drawers, and birthday party goodie bags. Decades later, the design remains almost unchanged, which says something about how right they got it the first time. Before screens took over fidget time, there was just you, a barrel, and 24 tiny monkeys daring you to beat your best. Stretch Armstrong was every kid's first lesson in pushing limits. At first glance, he looked like an ordinary blonde-haired action figure in wrestling trunks. But once you grabbed his arms and started pulling, the magic began. Stretch could extend over 3 feet and still return to his original shape. And that blew kids' minds. In a decade filled with rigid plastic toys, Stretch was soft, heavy, and squishy. A living stress ball you could battle, bend, and battle again. Every child who had one eventually asked the same question: how far can he go before he breaks? Some froze him, some boiled him, some tied him to door handles and pulled. Most Stretch Armstrongs met tragic ends, with oozy red gel leaking out like a horror movie. But it was all part of the experience. He was a science experiment you could hug. And even if he only lasted a summer, the memory stayed. He was not just a toy, he was a challenge, an obsession. And for many 1970s kids, Stretch Armstrong was the first thing they ever tested to destruction just to see what would happen. That weird, heavy feeling in your hands, that was resilience. That was curiosity. That was pure childhood. There was a sound to it. That little jingle of the front springer fork, the hum of the rear slick tire, and the occasional squeak of the banana seat as a rich kid pedaled past like they owned the neighborhood. The Schwinn Stingray crate was not a bike, it was a ride. With its bright paint job, tall sissy bar, and gear shifter right in the middle, it looked like something out of a cartoon. And for most of us, that is where it stayed. In dreams, in comics, in the unreachable parts of toy catalogs, those bikes cost money. Not the kind of money most parents could justify on a single-speed dream machine. But if your family had it, you showed up. That bike said you were living good. It said your parents wanted you to feel fast, strong, and cooler than any 10-year-old had the right to be. And we all noticed. They would ride it no hands, cruising past like they were floating. That sparkle in the paint job, that was not just sunlight, it was status. And you knew that even their bike got more compliments than anything you owned. You tried to act like your beat-up hand-me-down did the trick. But deep down, when that crate glided by, part of you wished just once it had been yours. In the 1970s, getting a TV signal felt like summoning the spirits. You did not just turn on the television and sit back, you had to work for it. That meant rabbit ears. That meant stretching, adjusting, and holding metal rods in every direction. And when the fuzz would not go away, there was only one solution: tinfoil. It crinkled, it sparkled, and somehow it worked. Wrapped like a desperate science experiment, your television antenna became a sculpture of hope and frustration. You might remember your sibling being the designated antenna holder, standing on one leg, arm raised, frozen in place while the rest of the family watched. It was trial and error, comedy, and chaos. The goal? A clear picture, even if it only lasted 5 minutes. There were always threats not to move, begging someone not to breathe too hard, cheering when the static cleared, booing when it came back. It was not just about the picture, it was about the ritual, the teamwork, the sacrifice. You learned patience, you learned creativity. You learned that a ball of tinfoil could mean the difference between watching your favorite show or sitting in silence. It was frustrating, ridiculous, and completely unforgettable. G.I. Joe changed everything the moment he marched onto toy shelves in 1964. Marketed not as a doll, but as an action figure, he offered boys the same kind of character-driven play that girls had with Barbie, but with a combat boot twist. The original 12-inch figure came with a military uniform, dog tags, and enough flexibility to strike a pose or take a fall. Kids could swap out his gear, helmets, rifles, backpacks, even scuba suits, and send him off on missions across the living room or backyard battlefield. It was the height of the Cold War, and Joe reflected that tension, but filtered through a child's sense of adventure. Over time, he evolved into a whole universe of characters, vehicles, and storylines. But those first editions were pure, iconic, and endlessly played with. G.I. Joe was a soldier, a sailor, an adventurer. He climbed trees, dove into mud puddles, and slept in shoebox barracks. For many boys growing up in the 1960s, he was the first toy that truly felt like theirs. He was more than plastic. He was valor, imagination, and action rolled into one heroic pose. And every kid who owned one remembers how it felt to gear him up for battle. Simon was not just a toy. It was a glowing memory test disguised as a game. When it was released in 1978, nothing else looked or felt like it. A black plastic disc with 4 glowing quadrants, red, green, blue, and yellow, it dared you to follow its sequence. And with each round, it got faster, more intense, more impossible. Kids gathered in basements and bedrooms, fingers trembling above the buttons, desperate to keep up with the hypnotic pattern. The sounds were etched into memory: high, low, sharp, hollow. Each note meant triumph or failure. Losing meant watching that smug little light flash mockingly while your friends laughed or groaned. But beating a high score? That was legendary. There was no screen, no joystick, just lights, sounds, and your ability to focus like a laser. In a world that often felt loud and chaotic, Simon forced you into silence, into pure attention. And for that moment, you were in control. You were brilliant. You were winning. It was like mastering a secret code no adult could understand. Simon was not just a game you played. It was a game that judged you. And in the late 1970s, that was the closest most kids got to feeling like they were living in the future. The Star Wars Early Bird Certificate package came out before the actual action figures did. Rich kids got a fancy envelope in the mail with a promise inside, a cardboard stand, some stickers, and a little certificate saying their figures were coming soon. That was the flex. You were not just playing with Star Wars, you were ahead of it. And if you were not in the know, it made you feel like you missed a secret meeting. This was 1977, right after A New Hope changed everything and toys were flying off shelves. Except these toys, they were not even on shelves yet. You had to pre-order. You had to believe. And most families were not dropping extra money on toys that did not even exist yet. It was not just about owning the figures. It was about being part of the moment before the moment. These kids had the bragging rights of being first, even before anything arrived in the mail. That little cardboard stand on their dresser said, "We knew before you did." But the ones who did, their kids strutted into school holding that display stand like it was the Holy Grail. They knew something you did not. Their action figures showed up in the spring, 4 little plastic legends: Luke, Leia, Chewbacca, and R2-D2. And you just stood there, trying not to care. But it was obvious. They had it. You did not. And you would never forget it. Mood rings promised to read your soul. Slip one on, and suddenly your finger was a window into your emotions. Or so we thought. The magic came from a tiny, color-changing stone set into a thick metal or plastic band. It shifted hues depending on temperature, but as kids, we believed it told the truth. If it turned blue, you were calm. If it went black, you were angry. Green? Maybe in love. We studied those little charts that came with the ring like they were sacred scrolls. Every recess and sleepover had at least one person interpreting moods. Sure, the science was sketchy, and sure, it mostly just reflected how cold or hot your hands were, but to us, it was real magic. It felt like the ring knew something we did not. Every kid had one, lost one, or begged their parents to buy one from a gas station or gift shop. The band turned your finger green eventually, but you wore it anyway. It was a talisman, a tiny crystal mood detector that let you feel seen, even if it was just a gimmick. To this day, nothing quite compares to the mystery and wonder packed into one shimmering, shifting little stone. Chatty Cathy was more than just a doll. She was the voice of a generation. Introduced by Mattel in 1960, she was one of the first mass-produced talking dolls, and for many little girls, she felt like a real friend. With her round face, blonde bob haircut, and soft vinyl limbs, She looked sweet enough. But the real magic happened when you pulled the cord on her back. Suddenly, Kathy could speak, saying phrases like, "Let's play school," or "I love you." She became a sensation almost overnight. Children were enchanted by her ability to talk back, even if her voice was tinny and slightly robotic. For parents, she was a marvel of engineering. For kids, she was a companion who never interrupted and always agreed. Kathy sparked a whole line of talking dolls and helped kick off a new wave of interactive toys. And although later toys would be flashier, louder, and more advanced, none carried the same simple wonder. For many, the sound of that pull string and the soft mechanical voice is a vivid echo of childhood. Chatty Kathy is often remembered not just for what she said, but for what it felt like to hear her talk for the first time. Before the Marvel Cinematic Universe, before endless superhero reboots, there were the Super Friends, a team of caped crusaders who met at the Hall of Justice every Saturday morning to fight crime and teach morals along the way. Superman, Batman, Wonder Woman, Aquaman, all voiced with booming authority and unwavering goodness. It was not about grit, it was about greatness. The animation was stiff, the stories were simple, but that did not matter. To 1970s kids, this was the Justice League. This was how you learned right from wrong. Every episode ended with a lesson, a reminder to share, to be brave, to tell the truth. The villains were rarely scary. What mattered was how the heroes responded, with courage, teamwork, and always a plan. Super Friends made you believe in justice, not as an abstract concept, but as something you could live out. On the playground, in your house, in your heart. It was not just fantasy, it was a moral compass. And those heroic theme songs still live somewhere in the back of every grown-up's mind. It made you believe that heroes were real, and that maybe, just maybe, you could be one too. It was the kind of thing that made you feel like you were in your own movie. The Sony Walkman, shiny, sleek, with its padded headphones and silver buttons, was a full-blown experience. Rich kids in the late 1970s had these strapped to their belts like they were carrying a portal to another world. Everyone else was stuck with boomboxes too big to carry or cassette players that needed 4D batteries. The Walkman changed everything. Suddenly, you could walk down the street with music just for you. You did not have to share it. You could press play, slide on those foam-covered headphones, and disappear. But only if your parents had the cash. These were not cheap. Getting one meant someone dropped real money to let you tune out the world. And that mattered. The kid with the Walkman had their own rhythm, their own world, and a volume knob that said, "I do not need to hear you right now." It turned ordinary walks into music videos, and for those without one, silence suddenly felt louder. The Walkman made you cool without saying a word. It turned bus rides, grocery store trips, and lonely afternoons into something cinematic. You felt behind if you did not have one. Like everyone else had the soundtrack to growing up, and you were just stuck in silence. The kitchen of the 1970s did not just serve food, it made a statement. And that statement was harvest gold and avocado green. These two colors dominated every American kitchen appliance. Your refrigerator, your stove, even your blender wore these colors like a uniform. It was not just paint, it was identity. These colors were supposed to represent nature, health, and a touch of luxury. Harvest gold had a warm golden glow that felt like sunlight. Avocado green was earthy and bold, a perfect match for the indoor plant movement and natural fiber craze of the time. But somewhere along the way, the trend turned into a punchline. Yet, for those who lived it, there is no forgetting. You remember the heavy click of the fridge door, the way the green surface reflected your face in the oven window, the hum of the blender making root beer floats. These were not sleek or modern. They were sturdy, reliable, and filled with the smells of Sunday dinners and burnt toast. Maybe you were not fond of these colors as a kid. Maybe you even hated them. But when you see them now, something deep inside stirs. They are more than colors. They are the palette of your childhood. Pop-Tarts were the answer to a morning dream. Breakfast that popped out of the toaster, ready in minutes, no dishes required. When Kellogg's introduced them in 1964, they were a marvel of modern convenience. Frosted or unfrosted rectangles filled with fruit, or what tasted like fruit, wrapped in pastry, packed in foil, and ready to heat. They hit shelves just as the pace of American life was speeding up. Moms needed fast. Kids wanted sweet. Pop-Tarts delivered both. Whether it was strawberry, brown sugar cinnamon, or wild blueberry, every box felt like a little promise that mornings could be easier. Even cold, straight from the foil, they were a hit in lunch boxes and after-school snacks. No plate? No problem. The smell of a warm Pop-Tart coming out of the toaster was almost as good as the taste. Crispy edge, gooey middle, and just enough frosting to feel like a treat. By the end of the 1960s, Pop-Tarts had become more than a convenience food. They were a cultural touchstone, turning rushed mornings into something fun. And while they've changed flavors and designs over the years, those early Pop-Tarts hold a place in memory like few other foods do. So tell me, which of these 60s kid challenges would you have crushed the hardest? Drop your pick in the comments, tap that like button if you felt the nostalgia, and hit subscribe so you never miss the next trip back in time.